I'm Bill Snodgrass. Welcome to this episode of The World Around Us. We're going to do a virtual lab. We're going to do a virtual lab today. In the description section, there is a link to a template for this lab. And, it's like pretty much sort of a pseudo-formal lab report. It's not exactly a formal lab report, but it's kind of a formal lab report. Starts off with an introduction and gives you some introductory material about chemical reactions. Introduction. Then there's a little bit of an observation section. The scientific method begins with we observe something and makes us go, wonder what's going on. So the observation was we were talking in class, we were having a class discussion on reactivity and all the different kinds of chemical reactions, what a chemical reaction is, properties, and all those sort of things. We talked about the endothermic and exothermic chemical reactions. So the exothermic reaction is one that gives off energy. Endothermic takes in energy. And so the reactants will actually cool down in an endothermic reaction. A student said, well, what happens if it's already cold to start with? Will it also react, or what will happen? This is the beginning of scientific inquiry, is the what will happen phase. What happens if? What will happen if? And so we talked about it a little further, and she made a guess. She made a guess that if it were cold to start with, it would not react as well. So now we have to take that guess and formulate it into a hypothesis. So we have to go into the hypothesis section, and we have to formulate that. And a hypothesis is going to be sort of an if-then relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. So as we're thinking about our hypothesis, we have to kind of come up with what are the independent and dependent variables. So the independent variable is going to be whether we have a warm reactant or a cool reactant. We're going to use the independent variable to be the temperature of the reactants. And then, so therefore, if the reactant is cool, so that becomes the independent variable. If the reactant is cool, the reaction will take place more slowly. That's what we're guessing. That's our hypothesis. So we're going to test that. So in order to test that, we're going to make sure that we have a difference of temperature, and so we are going to take the temperature of the cool reactant. I'm going to put the thermometer in. Just at this point, I'm going to put the goggles on because we're dealing with glass. We're dealing with an acid base, even though they're sodium bicarbonate and acetic acid. And the starting temperature of the reactant is 12 degrees. Trying to get all that back in. There's 50 milliliters in both of these, and there is a fourth of a tablespoon of sodium bicarbonate because it was a convenient way of measuring. So into the data section of the template, you want to write the starting temperature of the cold reactant was 12 degrees. The starting temperature of the warm reactant is 25 degrees. And now, somewhere you're going to have to write down these times. We're going to start with a beginning time, and then we're going to have a final time. We're going to let the reactants begin in the reaction thing, and then when the bubbles, because of the reaction of acetic acid and sodium bicarbonate forms carbon dioxide, and those bubbles are going to rise through the liquid and effervesce out of the surface of the reactant. So we want to see that the one that goes fastest will finish first. It's just like a race, like a cross-country runner. The one who runs fastest finishes first. The ones who run less quickly will finish later. So the reaction that stops first is the one that went fastest. Our hypothesis is that lower temperatures result in slower reaction. So we are at 3:30. It is 3:30. Write that down. We immediately see the formation of the gas. We see the gas rising to the surface of the liquid. I'm going to put the graduated cylinders out of the way, along with the thermometer. Those out of the way. And now you can see in the two beakers, you can see the bubbles rising to the surface. One thing that you can observe is the size of the bubbles in the cold reactant they seem to be smaller. And that's not really part of this experiment. But one thing that happens when you do science is you look at the reaction, you look at the results of your experiment, and sometimes that will trigger other questions. And there may be some hypotheses and guesses as to why those bubbles appear to be smaller in the cold side. This is the cold side over here, and this is the warm reactant here. Already, there seems to be a very distinct difference between the rate of reaction. It appears that the warm reactant at this stage is reacting more slowly and is now 3:31 and 20 seconds. So at 1 minute and 20 seconds, we have a very noticeable difference. This one is still running. It's got a long way to go before all of the reactants are used up. On the other side, it even now appears to be even closer. There are little streamers of bubbles coming up. One of the variables we're not going to do is we're going to agitate it. We're going to leave the beakers alone because agitating would cause the molecules to move around and could affect our timing. So we're going to just let them run. We are coming up on the 2-minute mark right now. That is 2 minutes. The production of bubbles is about to cease in the warm beaker. In the cold beaker, the reaction is still going on. You can see streamers of bubbles coming up in the cooler of the two beakers. There is one tiny little stream of bubbles still coming up in this one, and we are coming up on 2 minutes and 40 seconds. And the streams of bubbles in the cold reactant are still very, very noticeable, and quite a few of them. At now 2 minutes and 55 seconds, I do not see any more bubbles forming. There's a couple of bubbles stuck to the bottom and a couple that are on the surface that haven't popped. So now this one continues to run. There are still bubbles being produced in the cold side. So our initial guess, if this plays out like it seems like it's going to, that the cold reaction, the cold reactant caused the reaction to take longer to finish. And if that is the case, if we can say that, you know, the difference between the times is notable. There's a statistical procedure called significance. We're not going to say significant, but if the difference is you know, pretty impressive, we're going to conclude that our hypothesis is correct. We are now coming up on 3:34 exactly just now, 3:34. So that is 4 minutes, and this reaction is still taking place. So we're going to assume that the hypothesis is correct. The guess was that the colder the reactant, the slower it would run, and the data supports that. There are still bubbles forming. It is now 4 minutes and 30 seconds now, and it is still forming bubbles. So the hypothesis can be accepted. And so we want to state that in our conclusion that based on the data that was collected, that the hypothesis can be accepted. And just to let's say there's one tiny little streamer of bubbles, and we are at 5 minutes. I'm going to watch that as it comes to an end at 3:35 and 15 seconds. All right, so the reaction is ended in both of the containers, and we're going to call this complete. Now, if you're following along on the template, you should be down. You've done the data collection. You're ready to make your conclusion. And in the discussion of an experiment, there may be some things that you would want to ask and say, well, what if? and you would talk about different things that you might have thought about while you were doing this experiment that you would want to test in future experiments. That is all for this episode of The World Around Us. That is the virtual lab on reactivity as a function of reactant temperatures. We're going to accept our hypothesis, and hopefully you will like this video, subscribe to the channel, sign up for notifications, leave a comment, question, suggestion. What would you like to see done on this channel? Share this video with someone who might be interested in this, want to use this in their classroom maybe. And lastly, thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next episode.